West Virginia is increasingly seen as a state with a penchant for unusual stories, especially involving strange creatures. From the stories of the Mothman of Point Pleasant, to the Flatwoods Monster of the early 1950s, to the various UFO sighting flaps often associated with both of those events, there seem to be strange stories galore in the Mountain State. That has also come to include more than a few stories of wild, hairy man-like creatures in the hills.
West Virginia's a great location for them. Look at the area. Sparse population, lots of natural resources. I mean, they can stay well hidden. It's easy to hide in places like this. Look around you. I mean, you know, it's a great location. We know there's lots of deer here, which have been a food source from a lot of reports that they actually kill deer.
Pretty much the eastern third of the state is a national forest, which is nearly, it's not quite, but it's nearly 1 million acres. The deep valleys, you know, things can hide, the abundance of water. Food sources are here, you know, whether it's deer, which a lot of folks, you know, say that's their main food source, but we also have a lot of wild edibles, berries, blueberries. We have cranberry glades, we have blueberry glades, you know, things like that, blackberries. Yeah, we have a lot of nut trees. Walnuts, butternuts, chestnut trees, you know, things like that.
We are in the area that was a push-up area when the continents pushed apart. Appalachia as a whole you're going to see this along the Appalachian Mountain Range. But this specific section is extremely rugged. So we have this massive upheaval on the eastern front of our state. And then it looks like if you were to take a rug and crumple the rug up tight together, you have this ripple effect that trickles all the way through to the western side of the state. So our mountains here, where we're at right now, are extremely tight together. The valleys are extremely narrow, sometimes only the width of a creek, and then you're starting back up another mountain.
I've had a lot of people tell me stories. There are a lot of people who won't talk about them, obviously, for being ridiculed, made fun of. On Dolly Sods, there was a state trooper with some of his friends, and they had something stomping around them in the dark, and they were scared. They had their guns out, had their flashlights out, trying to see what it was. But he had also told me that he was training his German Shepherd to track. And he sent a friend of his out, and the friend said, well, I'll pick up a stick or something and hit a tree so you know when to send the dog, see if he can find me. So he hit the tree, and he let the dog go, and he started walking that direction, and he heard knocks again, and he said, I heard you the first time. He said, that one wasn't me.
I've probably got right around 100, or a little less than 100, but I've as far as me taking like a physical report, you know, you have those folks that just in conversation will tell you something. You know, those are way up there as well. Or you hear the hearsay story. Someone says, you know, my aunt or my uncle or my brother has seen something. But yeah, it's always somebody coming to you and talking to you about it.
I would say we get at least 2 a week, and we've been open a year, at least. I mean, sometimes it's more. And I mean, some of these mountain men that come in, you know they're not pulling your leg, because a lot of them are like, they'll sidle over to you and they're like, this isn't a joke, right? You really believe this, right? And then they'll tell you their story because they're afraid to be embarrassed. But so often these stories are very similar, and the characteristics that they're talking about, like false charges, the howling in the woods, the tree knocks, or just the curiosity of the animal, again, very similar. And they go back, some of these go back pretty far in this area. I mean, like back to like 1900 and before. So it's not a new thing. I mean, some of this is generational.
Once I became public with actually being comfortable talking about my sighting, a lot of people started just gravitating, saying, oh, well, okay, well, even my grandmother, she was like, well, okay, since you've told me this, she told me about a sighting that she had when I was a kid. And she was taking a free class over to community college. And when she was on the way home, she had a creature walk across in front of her vehicle and go straight up the mountain. And she said it was on 2 legs, and she said it was like a big gorilla. So, you know, that we're looking at something like that. My family members started opening up, and then, you know, some of the other people that would just hear about the story, they'd be like, oh, well, I got something to tell you, you know, something like that. Then we started Wild and Weird Radio. And when we started Wild and Weird Radio, it really exploded. I had a sighting back in 2001 that really gave me an interest into this phenomena. It was during hunting season, squirrel hunting season, and it was in an area that I was hopefully going to go deer hunt. It was just about a mile from my house, just up a mountain over the other side and looking onto the next mountain. It had been timbered recently, within about 5 years or so. So that area was nice and clean. There was a lot of berries and things like that, good edibles. So I knew it would bring stuff in to eat. So I wanted to go in there and check that out. And there was this big patch of mountain laurels, native rhododendrons. And I could go hide in those, and it was acted like a natural tree blind. And I rode my 4-wheeler up to the top of the mountain and walked my way down. And when I got down into the spot where I could see the laurels, I saw this black movement over in the clearing area. So I got excited. I'm thinking, I'm like, oh yeah, we're going to see a black bear. This will be awesome. And I will hunker down here in the laurels and just watch everything going on. So I get in there and get in position, and I immediately notice this is not a black bear. There's 2 larger individuals. One's positioned up closer to the tree line, and it's down on its haunches. Its back is towards me, and it looks like it's like slapping a tree and grinding and like scraping across the tree like this. Then the other one was over, and it was foraging on the ground. Hard to tell what it was after: grubs, mushrooms, some kind of roots. And then what caught my eye the most, and where most of my attention stayed, was with this little one. It was playing like a toddler. Like now watching my son, it was playing the way my son plays, and just out in the open and spinning and jumping and kind of doing like a cartwheel-ish thing, but not a full cartwheel. It was like, just going on its hands and flinging itself, And I watched him for, it felt like forever. I know the sighting didn't last terribly long, but when the wind shifted out of my favor, the big one immediately took notice and stood up off of its haunches. It turned its head, so I caught like a little bit of the jawline and like where the ear would be. And it's like it raised its head. I couldn't tell if it was smelling the air or what, looking back at it now. But I think that it made a noise that I couldn't hear, because the other 2 immediately responded to that. Once that was done, they migrated towards the big one and then slowly walked off into the tree line. And I just sat there kind of frozen. When these things stood up, it was huge. I went out and paced it out a year later. And I was within 60 yards. And now this was pacing it out, walking down and then walking back up. So if you're looking at it like in this kind of a scenario, the distance in air was shorter than the distance on the ground. But I wasn't close enough to see like super duper good detail or anything. I did notice that the collars were different on each one. The smaller one was the black one, and the medium size was a dark brown, and the bigger one had more red tint to its hair.
I grew up in Randolph County, and I lived down at a town called Norton, West Virginia, and we lived up in a hollow there. And I was only 12 years old Dad had a system for us kids to be able to go out at night and get armloads of firewood. He had these lights strung on these 16-foot poles out to the wood yard, and we had a big wood pile out there. They had a fire going, so he asked me and my brother and my sister to go out and get firewood. We had this little dog. His name was Whiskers, and he come right along with us, you know, just milling around. We was out there at the wood yard under that pole light. We was loading our arms up for firewood. Well, there's a breeze coming down out of the darkness out of the holler there, and we started smelling this stench, and it smelled like wet dog, wet horse. It's hard to describe. And we noticed Whiskers was standing there beside us as we was loading this wood into our arms, and the hair started standing up on his back. But he didn't do nothing at first. Then he started growling. And Whiskers turned around and run to the house. My brother said that must be a bear coming, you know, because we smelled it in the air. We had problems with bears before coming to the hog pen and getting after the young hogs. He said, drop your wood and run. So they dropped their wood. They took off for running. I kind of hesitated there a little bit, and you could hear this thing breathing. It sounded like a man with severe asthma as it come closer and closer. I decided I better go. So I dropped my wood and I turned around and started to run, and I didn't run 30 feet. And I thought, well, I'm going to see this bear. I turned around, and when he stepped up under that 16-foot pole light, his head was only, looked to me like a couple feet below that 16-foot light bulb up there shining. And he stood there, and he kind of weaved a little bit back and forwards as he was looking at me. And I could see he had black looking eyes. And he weaved back and forwards a little bit. And before I turned around to run, it made a grunt sound like, ruh! And it turned and walked out from under that light. And as it was walking out from under the light, that's when I flipped around and made it the rest of the way to the house and got in the house. Well, the next morning was Saturday morning. Mom and Dad was sitting on the couch. Mom said, Basil, why don't you just go out there and let these kids show you where that bear was at? So he looked at me and he said, well, come on, Boone. Let's go out there and you show me where this bear was at. Well, he asked me, he said, where was it at? I said, it was standing right here. Of course, there was wood chips and stuff there. You couldn't see no tracks. And he said, well, where'd it go? And I said, it went across the road and went up over the bank right there. We walked over there, and they must have been a 12 to 14 inch human footprint in the mud, sunk an inch and a quarter deep. And Dad looked at it. As soon as he looked at it, he shook his head, and I know he done this for us kids. He shook his head and he said, yep, just as I thought, it's a bear. So we went back in the house. Well, when we got back in there, Dad sat down beside Mom there on the couch, and we was watching them cartoons, but our ears was this big around. We was wanting to hear what was going to be said, you know. Mom leaned over to Dad. She said, Basil, did you see where it was at out there? What was it? Was it a bear? He leaned over toward Mom and he said, Ann, he said, I don't know what it was. He said, it wasn't a bear. He said it had a footprint that long, he said, and it looked just like ours, except flat-footed like, and it was down in the mud that deep. And he said it was not a bear. And that's what Dad said. And of course, we was right there, and we heard him say this. You know what I mean? I had to live with that all my life. Even going to school, high school, whatever, I lived, and that was always rolling in the back of my mind. A bear that's 10, 12 feet tall, that walks upright and looks like a human being, shaped like us and everything, but humongous in size, and then walks off. That bugged me all my years.
The one was actually the only instance where we had that a Bigfoot hurt somebody. And it was down near the New River Gorge, and he and his wife came in to see the museum, and big, huge dude. I mean, he was an ex-Marine, and you could tell he was one tough dude. So he walks in and he just asked me point blank, "Do you believe in Bigfoot?" And I said, "I've not seen one personally." I said, "But I actually do now from all the stories." And I said, they don't usually hurt people. And he said, "You can't say that anymore." And he pulled his shirt down, and he had this massive scar across his shoulder. He said that he was wanting to date this girl who ended up being his wife. He had just gotten out of the Marines, and he foolishly decided to take her swimming in the New River down in Nicholas County, which that's a whitewater rapid river. A stupid place to go swimming. But anyway, so they were swimming, and she started getting swept downstream, and he was afraid he was going to lose her. And so they were about a mile, they had gotten swept down about a mile from their car. So he saw a flat rock coming up, and he just grabbed her and threw her out of the water, really kind of roughly, just to get her out. And then he grabbed the rock and pulled himself up onto the rock, and he was trying to catch his breath, but he was facing up the mountain, she was facing the river, and he saw this really large creature standing there, and he said it was huge. And he said, "I'm a combat veteran from Afghanistan." He said, "I am not afraid of much of anything." And he said, "At that moment, I was terrified." He said, "This thing picked up this rock, and there was just anger radiating off of it. And it winged the rock at his head, and he ducked, but he couldn't duck fast enough, and it just hit his shoulder, ripped open his shoulder, and it hit the water. And it was starting to pick up another one. When it hit the water, she screamed, because it was a big splash right in front of him. She said, "Landslide." And he said, "No." He said, "Turn around slowly, but don't scream." And she turned around and saw it, and she was like, "What do we do?" And he said, "I think it thinks I'm trying to hurt you." He said, "So hug me." And it had already picked up another rock and was getting ready to throw it. She hugged him, and it dropped the rock. But it stood there and it was just swaying at him, and he realized they were going to have to walk back to the car past where it was standing. And he's like, "It's going to rip me apart." And he's bleeding profusely, and she's like, "We got to get you to a doctor." And he's like, and so he told her, "When we get to the tree where it was kind of standing behind this tree," and he said, "When we get to that tree, you just run and I'll hold it off." And he's thinking, there's not going to be anything left of me. But when he turned back around, it had already disappeared into the forest. And he said they could feel it watching him, but it never showed any aggression after that point. So he really thinks that it was thinking that he was hurting her, because it was never once looking at her. It was always angry at him. But that's the only instance of any aggression.
The one that I just took, and it supposedly happened in Marshall County in February. He's actually had a couple experiences there, and I've been monitoring his property. I've got cameras and stuff there. Nothing has been caught yet, but he has had an experience last October, and he's like trying to find answers. And in February, he found a couple impressions that he believes were tracks. I mean, they're not great, but I mean, it's same as around here. The substrate's just not great for him. As we're hanging out on the property, he told me, he said, "I found these," and then 4 days later I had a sighting. I was like, "Well, why haven't you told me until now?" And he said, "Well, I didn't want you still thinking I'm crazy that I'm seeing it." I was like, "Well, that's what I'm here for." He was walking his son to the bus stop, and his son got on the bus, and him and his dog was with him, and they were walking back toward the house. And his driveway, he calls it a lane, but it's probably 500 or 600 yards long. And as he's walking back, the dog stops and looks up to the left up on the ridge, and he looks up and he sees this silhouette on the ridge line. And he's thinking to himself, he's like, "Why is the neighbors up there, the neighbors' kids up there on the ridge?" And then he realized it's a lot bigger than what they are. And as he walked, he kind of nudges the dog along to come on. As it walked along with him, he says it put its arms, had its hands like upward, like kind of up like this, and he could see the hair hanging from its arms. And it walked the ridge, kind of slumped over, hunched over, and walked like paralleling him, and then it gets to a wash, where the ravine comes off, and he said that it jumps sideways like a lemur and lands on the other side and then hides behind a tree. And then he starts to walk, it goes again, and it does it again in another area where it jumps, and then finally it's out of his sight. And he describes it as not being a bulky thing. It was like lanky, tall and lanky.
Actually, it's been a couple of them that we've investigated ourselves with the collective, because they were sightings that we also followed up with trace evidence with. One of them was the Tinney account. That happened in early 2020. He was an amateur herpetologist, and he was conducting a salamander survey, which is a salamander migration survey. He's calculating the species, how many he's seeing moving, breeding animals, things of that nature. And he was ran off of this second site that he went to that night by a creature that yelled at him and then rushed his immediate area. And when he got back into his vehicle, it actually yelled again and reverberated the windows in his vehicle. And he and another witness that was in the vehicle with him both attest to that. He got a hold of us because he knew that we were into all the weird stuff. He didn't know that we were into active field research. And we said, well, yeah, we actually think you had a weird experience. Where was this? And then we were on site the next day. And after getting all the notes and everything from him, it was about just over, I think it was 36 hours roughly between he had his experience and we went on site, and we were able to recover tracks from that area. Then the other would be the Wineberry site. The witness had described having a very emotional time. And she went out up on the top of the mountain. It was on a power line cut. And she was up there sitting on the center block base for the big power line cut, or for the big power station. She'd just gotten in a fight with somebody, and she was up there crying and just, I guess, making a lot of noise. And it drew the attention of this creature. And the creature exposed itself from the trees and was standing there watching her for a little bit. And she noticed it, and we were able to go out and we did a site recreation with her, and then we were also able to collect a track from that area as well. All right, so this is just going to be a small sample of the best tracks that we have in our collection that we've cast going out into the field in either our research areas or where we've had sightings reported that we've gone to investigate and actually been able to turn up some physical evidence. These two right here were left and right that were from the Tinney incident in Kanawha State Forest. You got a really good rounded heel shape here, and you can see where the mid-tarsal breaks at. This one you can see the mid-tarsal break a little bit better because it's more planed out foot. And this is a bear track, and so is this. These are tracks. We always put these out on the table because we let people see them, and we tell them that, you've got 2 bears on the table. Try to find them. Ones that give me. And this one is the one that a lot of people will confuse actually with a possible Bigfoot track. But it's absolutely a bear. This one my wife actually found when we were out hiking, and we've had this one reviewed by Jeff Meldrum and Tom Shea and Cliff Barrickman. They've all taken a look at it, and Tom actually showed us how this foot displayed independent toe movement, and you can see it in the cast because you've got your big toe here, your pinky toe here, your 2 middle toes started right here. And then they drew up, like they gripped into the mud individually and pulled it down to here, and you can see where the tendons were flexed out in the foot. So that was pretty neat. And then these were found on a creek bank, and going up a mountain, a raccoon stepped in the big toe here. And then here's the same foot. This is the same big toe that would have been there, but it was going up the hill. So I had to get creative with how I put the plaster in that one. It was all kind of slopped and smudged in there. And then this is a copy from the Wanbury site. This is a 3-inch big toe, and then you got a pinky toe over here. This was overpour. This outside edge is all overpour, and so you got toe, 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 and then the back of the heel is back here. And then this was poured by Beth, and when you lay it, the heel on the heel, it looks like the back end partial of the same creature.
While many of the stories you've just heard come from all over West Virginia, there is one area of the state that is unique when it comes to more than just Bigfoot stories. Sutton, West Virginia is near the geographic center of the state. In recent years, this little town has gained the attention of many, as it is home to not only the West Virginia Bigfoot Museum, but also the Flatwoods Monster Museum, just down the street.
So our location doubles. It's both the Flatwoods Monster Museum and the Braxton County Visitor Center. Briefly, the Flatwoods Monster was at least thought of to be an alien encounter that took place on September 12th, 1952 in the small town of Flatwoods. That's just about 4 miles north of Sutton. What happened was there were all these kids playing on basically the yard of the Flatwoods Elementary School, and it was later in the evening, getting close to 7 o'clock or so, but not quite. And they see this object, bright object, some described it as like fiery, shoot across the sky and appear to land on a nearby hilltop. But 3 of them decided to go check it out. So 2 of the boys, who are brothers, decided they would stop at their house because their mom was home, so to tell her what they were up to. And so their mom, Kathleen, decided to go with them, as well as grab a neighbor who was also a cousin of hers, Jean Lemon. So the whole group of kids and adults, 7 in total, and they're going up this narrow path up to the top of this hill. And as they're heading up this path, by this point it's completely dark, well past 7 o'clock in the fall. And at the top of the hill, they notice this bright light that they assume is what they just saw come through the sky. But then they notice, from their left, they notice some movement. And so they turn their one flashlight toward it and see this estimated between 10 to 12 foot tall figure sort of looming in the woods. And as they notice it notices them and sort of comes toward them. And of course they get petrified, turn, run back down the hill. By the time they get home, they call the police, and the local sheriff and his deputy get out there to investigate sometime later. And by the time they get up to the hill, the light's gone. This mysterious appearing figure was gone, which would later become known as the Flatwoods Monster. But the one thing that still lingered was, they said, what accompanied the appearance of this, the monster in the woods, was this sort of awful smell that filled the area and stung their eyes, their noses, and their throat. So that was still lingering in the air by the time the sheriff and his deputy got there. But so then subsequently, Kathleen May was good friends with a local newspaper owner and writer. So relatively quickly, like by the next day, the story was reported in the newspaper, and it was picked up by the AP and ended up being international news within like a week. It was just a really, for the time especially, a very uncommon story. It was really uncommon because of the amount of witnesses and the range of witnesses that were involved. And I think that's one of the things that's made such a lasting impression.
It actually all started because we have a small consignment store, and so we have about 70 local consigners. And one of my local consigners is a wood carver, and so he carved this big statue. So he brought this big thing in, and I saw it, and I said, "Oh, you brought me Bigfoot." And he actually got kind of annoyed with me, and he's like, "No, that's not Bigfoot." And I said, "Well, what is it?" And he said, "This is the old man of the mountain." He said, "We don't have any Bigfoot here." He said, "But we have a lot of old men of the mountain." And he said, "They're not nasty." And I said, "Well, what's the difference?" And he said, "It's a big animal, bigger than a bear." He said, "But they don't cause trouble like bears do." And he said, "They're all over the mountains around here." So we had it standing in our store, and there were just person after person, and it wasn't the town drunk. We're talking about normal people from normal walks of life. I just saw one 3 months ago, or, "Oh, I saw one when I was a kid." I mean, it was just so many stories. And then we ended up, Les Odell saw it on the internet because people were taking pictures with it, and he showed up, and he's a Bigfoot researcher here in West Virginia, and he said that he was looking for a place to put his collection, and we were in the process of expanding the store. And so we ended up deciding to change gears altogether and turn it into a Bigfoot museum. So he was really instrumental in helping us, and then he introduced us to Daniel Smith, and so he brought us his whole collection that's right around us, and then Dr. Meldrum's been helping us. So it just kind of grew from nothing, but the locals definitely do not call it Bigfoot. They call it the old man of the mountain, and then the ones that are of Indian descent, they call it Stone Man.
I've been blown away by the amount of interest. I would say every other person that comes in the Flatwoods Monster Museum, will tell me that the reason why they're in town is because they went there and then they told them, "Hey, you should check this place out too before you leave." And the same thing happens vice versa. We have a lot of Flatwoods Monster fans that come visit us, and we'll say, "I'll just say, there's a Bigfoot museum just down the street." And almost, in every case, people are like, "What? Just right down the street?" "Yeah, right down the street. Like, don't even move your car. That's how close it is." So it's really been great, the amount of the people that are into Bigfoot that as a result learn about the Flatwoods Monster, and people that are into Flatwoods Monster. I mean, it's not like they're learning about Bigfoot, but they're learning there's this sort of archive of history for Bigfoot in West Virginia just right down the street. So I think it's kind of a given. If you're interested in one, you'll probably at least have a curiosity about the other.
Geographical proximity of the museums aside, there is one crossover between the Flatwoods Monster and Bigfoot that is quite intriguing.
There was one report in particular where it was printed in the paper either in the 60s or the 70s. And basically the headline of the article was, like, Braxton County Monster returns. But when you read the article, it talks about a delivery man who was on his route and encountered some mysterious creature. At no point in the article is the words Bigfoot or Sasquatch ever written, but what they described is exactly what you tend to think of when you think of a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I think the height was like around 7 to 8 feet, covered in dark hair, and being like kind of man-like but kind of animal-like. But there's been Bigfoot and Bigfoot-like reports kind of dotted throughout the history of central West Virginia and Braxton County. Like, there's a Wildman report that, if memory serves, dates back to, I think, 1917. It is strange that in the early 1900s there's a Wildman report that takes place in Flatwoods, decades before the Flatwoods Monster sighting. That's just serendipitous, at least.
Yeah, there's a lot of historical reports out of West Virginia, and this region in particular, because the Shawnee used to come in off the Ohio River and up the Kanawha, and they'd use it as a hunting grounds only. They viewed it as cursed land. They didn't want to stay here long. It was also known as the Valley of the Giants. Another name that was also used by the Shawnee was the Valley of Headless Giants. And if you use your imagination and you think what ghosts sound like, what the moaning, droning sounds, and then you combine that with you're on a very small, primitive boat going up river, first light, and the fog is rising off the riverbanks, it's rising off the rivers, it's coming up off the flat valleys. You see these large ominous figures in the mist making these droning sounds. To me, my imagination can show me that, yeah, this might be a possible Bigfoot. Could be. It then goes into the early settlers in West Virginia as well. This particular area where I live, the area behind us where we're shooting right now, there was a historical account from the 1870s. Right here, there was a group of people from this area that chased a wild man up this valley and into the bowl that terminates up here about a couple hundred yards away from where we're at right now. And it was allegedly shot 30 plus times, and the creature stood up and took off running up the mountain after that. So over 30 musket balls were allegedly put in this thing, and it still took them and ran. And then there's all these other wild man sighting reports, and wood booger, you know, the boogers and wood boogers, and the Devil Hollow and Booger Hollow, and all of these different places in this area that were named after something. And those aren't including your modern day sightings like the Polk Gap Monster. The Polk Gap Monster there was hundreds of sighting reports that were sent in. There were, I think, 2 books written about this creature specifically, just a compilation of sightings. We happen to have some track casts that support the evidence that this thing could have actually been there. West Virginia is a really weird place, you know. We've got stories like Mothman and the Flatwoods Monster, and the government took some of those very seriously, and particularly the Flatwoods Monster incident. The SETI project began just months after the Flatwoods incident, and the satellites that they used for the SETI program are in Green Bank, West Virginia. That structure was founded and commissioned and established in months after the Flatwoods incident. That kind of made West Virginia, I guess, the epicenter for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence at that point. Then we've got all of these other folklore stories that follow around from all the people that migrated and became immigrants into this area. So now you have a state that is abundant in strangeness, but is also now an abundant in different cultures. And those cultures bring with them their own stories, and then those stories come to life here in the mountains.
Just, if you're out there, keep your eyes out. Check, listen. And if somebody tells you something, they're probably telling you the truth.
For part 2 of West Virginia Wildman, join us as we head into the hills and forests of the Mountain State in search of the source of all these stories and legends.